name is Ifat. I'm from the Department of Medical Neurobiology. I'm working on motor control, and I will, in the next few talks, how do I record?
If you use somewhere?
I'm sorry, I cannot hear. Yeah.
כאילו, בדרך כלל כדאי את הרמקול. מיקרופון אחד, אז הדבר הזה לא...
Okay. Sure. Okay, so I'll talk about motor control, and basically I'll talk about control of voluntary movement, and voluntary movement I mean mostly of the upper limb. I think you already learned a little bit about reflex pathways, a little bit about CPGs maybe, central pattern generators, hopefully spinal CPGs. You also learned about eye movement, and what we're going to talk about is mostly voluntary movements, and the model that we're using is the upper limb. So I'll start, these are what I'm going to talk about in general. So I'll give a brief introduction about properties of motor control and like conceptual models. Maybe today I'll start with descending pathways. I mean, hopefully today. It would be very sad if I won't. I'll talk about descending pathways, the corticospinal system, and other motor pathways. Then I'll talk about the motor cortex and premotor areas. Okay. So, first thing first. So when we voluntary movement is something that we do on a daily basis, but in a kind of mindless manner, right? I mean, we reach and hold and grasp, and we don't really think about the details of these actions. However, I mean, these are some of these actions can be very complex and evolved. Nevertheless, I mean, we know very little about what are the computational and physiological principles that underlie this system. So, underlie the system that actually allows us to reach and grasp in a very fast and precise manner. And this is really what we are trying to understand. How can we perform this rather complex computation on the fly, right? I mean, we're doing it very fast, completely in a non-conscious manner, right? I mean, when I reach to an object, I take into account the size of the object, the weight. I predict all this information, but in a unconscious manner, right? And I use these predictions in order to prepare myself for the for the process of grasping the object. And if there is any mismatch between my prediction and what the object is really like for example, if this won't be like it will only look like a plastic glass, but it will actually be much heavier than I expect, there'll be a mismatch and there'll be a correction. So we have predictions, but these predictions are continuously being updated according to reality. And in some way, the system is actually doing this very fast and very precisely. So we use visual, somatosensory, and any other kind of information to plan, to predict, and to execute these actions. But still, I mean, there's still an ongoing debate about the computational and the physiological principles that are actually govern these performance. So previously in the past, people thought, I mean, okay, so this is taken from the work of Edward Muybridge, and that's before he killed his, Edward Muybridge actually was a photographer that thought that you can actually study motor actions just by observing on a single frame basis the movement. So he actually, this is one example of him trying to understand the process that underlies galloping of a horse, right? I mean, so he actually was able to analyze the time, the contact with the surface, with the floor, and the arrangements of the legs during this process. So this is one example. The second example that he used is actually, this is actually himself. He took photos of himself throwing this stone. And his idea was that if we put cameras, he put several cameras around these around the scene and managed to take single frames and then generate a movie. So he's considered to be like the first person that actually made a motion, like a motion film or a movie. But his idea was not necessarily the entertainment aspect, but rather trying to understand how movements are being controlled and generated. And what I said before, later on he got involved. He killed the lover of his wife, and that was kind of. But at the time, it was considered to be a completely justified homicide, and I don't think he served any time in prison. So days, different days, different times. I mean, it's like kind of. But anyway, today what we know is that analyzing the movement can only explain very little about the way we control action, because the process or the important part of the motor capabilities is the neural infrastructure. So if we look at evolution, I mean the muscles and the musculoskeletal infrastructure has not been changed dramatically, but what changed and what is in correlation with the difference in motor performances is the neural infrastructure. And that is really what we are interested. I mean, we're not using detailed analysis of the way we move, but we are trying to understand how the nervous system actually controls action. So what are the motor system is in fact a rather difficult system to study, because unlike a sensory system, we don't really know what is the parameter that is controlled for. Like in sensory system, the task is very simple, right? I mean, what is the purpose or what is the aim of any sensory modality? What do you think is the aim, like of the visual system? What we would like to generate in the visual system? Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of we want to have an internal representation of the world. But for the motor system, this is of course not the aim, right? I mean, we want to generate an action. So for many years, I mean, and still now, we are using a vocabulary or approach that was adapted for sensory system in order to understand the motor system. Representation of information, how we actually external and internal coordinate frame. But these are, in many ways, I mean, these are at least the vocabulary that is used for sensory system. So, but for motor system, we need to understand we need to better define the questions in terms of motor control. Now, in order to kind of is it really important to study the motor system? So I will argue that yes, motor system, basically motor behavior is behavior, or muscle control is behavior. There is no behavior without muscle activity. I mean, you can think of any type of behavior, like even what we think is a high-level behavior, like talking and any type of facial expressions. These are cognitive representations that are being made or performed using muscle activity. So understanding the motor system is in fact understanding behavior, and we cannot really understand behavior without it. Okay? Now, of course, I mean, this is a very, trying to understand behavior using motor control is a really large or maybe grand goal, but today, I mean, we are actually facing several, people who are studying motor control are facing several important pressing questions, and that is, we still trying to understand the computational principles that underlie motor actions, both in terms of motor behavior and in terms of the neural circuitry, and I'll explain very soon. We don't really understand what is the contribution of each brain area to motor output. And in each brain area, I'm talking about what is the cerebellar impact on motor output, what is the basal ganglia. I mean, we are talking about midbrain pathways. There are multiple brain areas that we know that if they are damaged or destroyed, there are clear motor impairments. But what is the contribution of these areas, specific contribution to performance of actions, it is not quite clear. We are trying to understand the sensory-motor integration. When motor and sensory areas interact, how they interact, and for what purpose. What is the difference, for example, from visual motor integration compared with somatosensory motor integration? For example, we think that somatosensory sensation is critical for performance of movement. However, at the same time, we know that when we move, there is a general suppression of incoming sensory information. So if we need the somatosensory information, why do we suppress it at movement? And not only does we suppress it, the motor cortex is responsible for this suppression. So what is this dual interactions between motor control and somatosensory information? We would like to learn more or to understand better the process of motor learning. And in motor learning, I talk about skill learning or adaptation, motor adaptation. We learn skills in different ways, by practicing, by observing, okay? Some of my motor skills I learned because I practice, right? I mean, you learn how to write, and you practice it more, and you get better. However, other motor skills, or in addition to practicing, there is also a learning by observation, right? Like there is this concept of, aha, that's how you do it, right? I mean, you observe someone like doing this juggling, right? Ball juggling. And by looking at the performance, you can actually learn how these two paradigms are being taken place. It is not, I mean, this is something that we would like to know. And we'll see that there are systems for learning by observation versus learning by practicing. Motor adaptation. We adapt very fast to any type of external perturbations. How do we do it? What is the mechanism that allows us to adapt? I mean, basically, you can see that your entire life, I mean, we learn how to walk, but we can perform this walking even if we walk in water, right? You go to the swimming pool, you walk, you can walk in water. In fact, this is a very different motor goal or motor task than walking in air, right? In terms of the forces that you encounter and so on and so forth. Still, you don't have to relearn walking. Or during the time from childhood to adulthood, we grow in size, right? I mean, this is part of growing up. We grow in size. Nevertheless, I mean, so again, I mean, the system now needs reaching is a very different thing when your arms are longer compared to when you are a child. But we don't need to relearn these processes. So there is something fundamental about the motor task that is scalable with size and with external environment. But it means that the system can very efficiently adapt to different conditions. And how it is done is something that we would like to know. Coordination, interjoint or interlimb coordination. There is a global coordination across our body when we move. Everything is well coordinated. Eye and head and hand, all of these. When we make an action, we don't separate it to different control, but we move in a very well coordinated manner. Even in a single limb, when you reach, there is a coordination between your shoulder, elbow, and the fingers. Because as I move, my fingers already in a predictive manner are actually V-shaped. So I will grasp exactly the object that I'm aiming for, right? I mean, if it's a large object, my grasp will be specifically designed for that. How do we actually, and there is a very precise temporal relationship between the movement of the arm, of the shoulder, the elbow and the wrist, and the finger opening during reach to grasp. So there is some mechanism that allows us to well coordinate our actions according to our needs. When we move, there is interlimb coordination, okay? And but we know that each limb is being controlled separately, right? I mean, from different brain area. So there is the right motor cortex and the left motor cortex. In the spinal cord, there is laterality, but somehow, for example, the head and the trunk are being controlled separately, but somehow the system is well coordinated. So these multiple controllers, each controlling different parts of our body, are synchronized in a manner to allow a coordinated movement. And the last, and maybe one of the more important, especially recently, questions that we would like to address in motor control is the question of how can we compensate for injuries that produce motor deficit. So, many cases, there are injuries that cause a spinal cord injury, stroke, ataxia. All these are injuries that produce motor impairments. These impairments can range from a very maybe limited impairment, okay, very limited deficit, motor deficit, or severe motor impairment. Spinal cord injury could actually produce, if it's high enough, it can produce complete quadriplegia, right? I mean, the complete loss of ability to move in all limbs, lower and upper limbs. And we would, but in fact, if you think about it, the machinery is intact. It's just the connection is injured. So if we can actually compensate or bypass this block of information flow, we may be able to compensate for these deficits, for this very severe deficit, stroke, ataxia. There is a lot of redundancy in the system. Nevertheless, all these focal lesions often produce permanent impairments. And the question is, can we bypass using the mechanism that we know operate normally? Adaptation, learning, integration, and so on and so forth. So these are some of these questions I will try to address in the next few lectures. And we'll see how far we'll go. So, yes. Because if we look at and we'll see it when I'll talk about the system, the anatomy of the system. For example, you'll see that there are parallel pathways connecting from the motor cortex to the spinal cord. There are connections that both contralateral connection and ipsilateral connection. So the system is sort of includes a presumed backup system. So how come we're not using this backup system? Obviously, we're not using it because the deficit stroke patients often have very, very limited movement ability in the contralateral side. Okay, so if your lesion is confined to the right hemisphere, you will have severe motor areas. Okay, you'll have severe deficit at the contralateral side of the left hand or the left leg or the entire left part of your body. However, we know that there are also ipsilateral connections from the left hemisphere, the intact hemisphere, to the left side of the body, but we are not using it. And the question is, why aren't we using it when it's necessary? And what can we do to promote usage of this remaining system for recovery? Now, another thing that we see is that the motor cortex during normal skill learning is very plastic. So when we learn specific skills, the representation in the motor cortex changes dramatically. However, if there is a stroke, if there is a permanent damage, it's unclear how come this plasticity that we know exists in the motor cortex cannot take place. I mean, or at least doesn't help us to recover from the injury. So in the normal or the intact brain, we know that there are many mechanisms that could potentially help us to restore function. However, during injury today, they're not being employed, at least not properly. And the question we are trying to understand is, can we target these mechanisms in order to promote recovery? Either naturally or using the infrastructure that we have, or by using controlling external devices. Okay? And we'll talk about it a little bit later. But, I mean, it's a good point. There is some kind of contradiction between what we know from normal state to what happens when the system is injured. Okay. So now, what do I mean by motor control? So what are the steps? What are the basic steps that allow us to make a movement, or that we think are taking place when movement is? Is there any something point? No, this is not. Almost. There is no stick. Okay. Yeah. A laser pointer. Yeah. Maybe. No laser pointer that I see. It just looks like there is something that should be here. Oh, okay. All right. So I'll try it during the break. Okay. So we are trying to make a movement. What are the steps the system needs to go through in order for the movement to be properly produced? So first, we have an external target. Thank you. So we have an external target, this cup of water. We need, first of all, the target is in the world, right? But we need to define it. We need to translate these externally defined targets into internally defined targets, okay? Because the visual system works in world coordinates, right? It defines targets in what we call world coordinates. The target is on my right, and or wherever the target is. Now I need to actually define it in coordinates that are centered across my body. Okay, so everything needs, and that should be, because, okay, for example, if I want to grasp something in right hand or left hand, it doesn't matter for the visual system, right? The visual system provides information that is invariant to the posture of my body, right? But at some point, we need to define it in what we call egocentric coordinates. Coordinates that are being centered on my body and are actually rely on the movement that we want to that we want to use. At the same time, other than defining the target, okay, we need also to define the location of the hand or the tool that we're going to use via either proprioceptive and or visual information. Okay, so I know where I want to go to. I know where is my hand. These two are very important first steps in order to plan the movement, right? Now, the proprioception is in fact sufficient for me to know where is my hand. I don't need to look at my hand in order to see where it is, right? Of course, if I see my hand, it helps. I mean, but I don't need to see it unless there is some problem in the system. So, for example, people who suffer from cerebral ataxia, they cannot perform movement like this, okay, to touch your own nose without visual, or they cannot make any movement, any precise movement without visual feedback, because there are some problems with proprioception. But we are talking now about normal case. We need to define the target. We need to define the plant, the effector, using proprioception or visual information. And based on these 2 points in space, we can plan the movement. Now, we can define 2 ways or 2 processes that help us to plan the movement. First, we can compute the endpoint based on the joint angles. So, if I know all the angles of my joint, I can tell you, or the brain can tell me where my hand is. Okay, based on the joint, we can know where my endpoint is, because everything is connected, and there is one solution for this problem, right? Now, this is what we call a forward kinematic model. Based on the joint angles, we know where the hand is, and we can actually make a movement, right? If I know the function of joint angle in time, I can predict the trajectory of my hand. On the other hand, I can also, if I know my defined or my goal or my target, I can compute the inverse, in an inverse manner, the joint angles that are required to reach this point. Okay? So we can actually either based on motor command, predict the position of the body, and that's a forward model, or based on the desired trajectory, we can actually compute the required command in what is called an inverse model. Okay? So these are 2 different things. You can predict where the hand will go based on joint angles, based on the command, and at the same time, I can give you the command or the trajectory, the end result, and you can compute the command. Okay? And this is an inverse model. And the system, because there is the joints, and at a given point in time, the distances don't change, right? It's not that my arm is not elastic, right? It's a stiff, more or less, kind of between the joints. The distance is fixed. There is these 2 transformations are possible. Okay? Although I will not go into this, but so we can compute forward kinematic models and inverse kinematic models. And what we think is that the system continuously uses both strategies in order to make a movement or to send a command, and at the same time predict the outcome of the command and compare, so it can compare what is the prediction and the actual action and generate some error signal. So what do I mean by this? So the system is actually, the motor system, as I said before, performs a task that is inverse to what the sensory system is doing, right? The sensory system generates a representation of the world. The motor system, motor processing, starts with an internal representation, which is basically what I want to obtain, my goal, and using that actually generates the motor command that will produce the movement. Now we know that there is a mathematical relation between joint angles and position in space. And the system, we call the system that computes this transformation between joint and position, an internal model system. Because the body, we need to actually generate, we have an internal model of our body that allow us to compute these relations between joints and hand position. If I don't have any knowledge, any model of my body, this basically cannot be done, right? Because if I have no information about the length or the relationship between joint angles and hand position, there is no way for me to compute what will be the outcome of the motor command. We have to have some internal model of the system. Now, how do we use it normally? So, basically, we have some desired behavior. There is a goal. Okay? I have a goal. That's what I want to do. Using an inverse model, I generate a motor command. What is an inverse model? You take a goal and translate it to joint angles. And you get an actual behavior. Now, normally, you could think, okay, that's enough, right? Then feedback from here could go back and correct if there is any mismatch between the actual and the desired behavior. However, what is the problem with this scheme of this simple feedback system, what we call? What is the inherent problem with this? Yes. So, time, because by the time the behavior is performed and the feedback is sent back, right? I mean, behavior means here, and feedback is sent back. This is way too long. The time that it takes us to process this feedback is too long. And what happens for any feedback system with long delays? What is the problems with long delays in a system, in a feedback system? It's unstable. Okay? Like, for example, I remember when I was a student, Eli Nelken was a kind of a senior TA, and he taught us about problems of delays. So, okay, so you go to a shower, right, in Jerusalem at least, where many houses, the pipes are old and kind of rusty, and so you enter the shower, the waters are too cold. You kind of immediately turn the knob, and you want to make the water hot, but it doesn't, you don't feel anything, so you turn it more and more and more. All of a sudden, you are being like completely burned by the water that are too hot. So you kind of turn it back to cold, and then by the time you get the feedback, you already did the action, right? So for actual feedback, so you understand why long delays will generate an unstable system. It will oscillate around the temperature, in this case, okay, in this example that you want. Because if the feedback was instantaneous, you probably could reach steady state very fast. But in a system, in a feedback system, it's called negative feedback system with long delays, there is a problem of instability. So here, this is one problem. By the time we get the feedback, the movement is already performed, right? The command was already sent. You cannot correct, but it will bring to oscillations at the end point, because you'll correct and you'll try to move back and forth until these systems are very unstable. So instead of relying on the actual feedback, what the system is using is an efference copy. It actually sends a copy of the motor command to a forward model. What does a forward model do? Okay? We just said, what is the purpose? Okay, what is the purpose of forward model? To take motor command and generate a prediction, predict the behavior. And in this manner, actually the predicted behavior can be, first of all, can be compared to the desired behavior. And we can generate an error signal very fast. If our motor command was imprecise, we can already fix it even before it reaches the actual behavior. There is an online correction that is faster. Yes?
If the system is the one that generated the motor command, so for the system to generate its own error signal there would never be an error signal because it generates on baseless prediction. That's not if I explain my question.
No, you say that there is some kind of an inherent contradiction in the system that how come, what you are saying, how come there is a discrepancy between the forward model and the inverse model, right? The inverse model generated the motor command.
It's like me checking my own exam. I would get
I think this is a great idea, actually. No, but you can check his exam, and that would be actually a better thing. So these are not necessarily the same site. So we think, for example, the inverse model could be implemented in the motor cortex, and the forward model could be implemented in the cerebellum, for example. And in that case, because these two structures are separated, you can actually have a forward model that is independent of the inverse model. Also, error in this system are not necessarily will be transmitted to this. So if the inverse model and the forward model are being computed by two different sets of networks or by two different networks, errors here that could happen because of some our problems of in the internal model or or some kind of miscalculation of sensory feedback in this level could be not errors here are not necessarily transmitted here. So this is a sort of a checkup system at the level of the motor command, even before we are performing the action. But these are not, it's not a single system. But the model, you can say that this is an internal model, right? This is a system that basically takes a desired behavior and make actual behavior with some internal mechanism for correction, okay? That can be either at the level of the command and later on at the level of the actual behavior. Because actual behavior there is a way for the actual behavior also sends some feedback back to the computational system in order to see, okay, maybe, for example, if there is a perturbation, someone pushed my hand by mistake. There is some external perturbation that cannot be analyzed by any of these systems, not by the inverse model and not by the forward model. You cannot predict any external perturbation. However, you can correct for it by feedback. Okay? Now, actually, yesterday, yes.
So anyway, I think that there is some move from the predict behavior to the inverse model.
Yeah. So I'll show you in this slide. So actually, I found that of all places, Wikipedia, there is a very good, more formal representation of what is how the system is actually used. So we have the inverse model. Okay, we have a reference input, which is what the goal that we want to make. We have the inverse model that generates the motor command that goes to the plant. There is some noise source, okay? Some source of noise. And then at the same time, the inverse, or the motor command that is being produced by the inverse model is relayed to the forward model, okay? And these actually, some combination of the output of the plan and the predicted position are being sent back as a feedback to the system. Now, you can see that there is differences in timescales here, right? Because the predicted model will actually be combined with output of the plan that was generated a little bit before, right? There is a time lag between these two signals, but they're both being sent back as a feedback signal. And this is what we call a basic internal feedback, okay? And you can learn more about it. But it means that for the system to generate an appropriate movement, we need to continuously first compute a motor command using an inverse model, but we also use a forward model that will generate a prediction of the body movement and will be used as a feedback signal as well. So,
So are the comparisons here between the forward model and the inverse model, and then another comparison between the inverse model and the actual movement? Or?
So the exact implementation is more complicated. So you can think.
Not about the implementation, just about what kind of computation is done.
Yeah. So.
It seems here there is one comparison.
Well, there is one comparison here and another one here. I mean, basically, between prediction and actual, and then both of them are being used as a feedback. Now, whether this is being done in two separate steps, or in one step, or in one single step, there are kind of physiological evidence that these are two steps that are being carried out separately. But it's not, I'm not so sure that it matters for the system. I mean, whether this is done in both, or the forward model just being sent back directly here. You know, I'm not so sure that it matters for the system. I need to think about it. I mean, if you'll just connect this back, or have a comparison here and send the results back, I'm not so sure it will matter. But I have to think about it. Okay, so now it means that the system should have some actually uses not only a feedback or just inverse model, but also a prediction. And one example, trying to see. Yeah. So, can you come for a second here? I'll show you one example that shows this is. I hope this is heavy enough, but probably I don't know if you already saw this example. Can you just put your hand like this and hold it? You already saw this. No. Okay. So now, now hold it well. What happened when it went up? Why did it go up? What does it mean that the hand, when I lifted it, but now you lift it yourself, it's not that heavy. Okay, so no, lift it with your other hand, like what I did. Yep. So your hand stay in place. Okay, did you see the differences? What does it mean that the hand went up? Yes, it was I use the Kandel and Schwartz book, because that's kind of a heavy duty thing, but unfortunately I don't have it here, so what does it mean that the hand went up? Why did the hand went up when I took it, but not when? It means that there was some sort of a prediction, right? I mean, so you actually predicted the force that needs to be performed by this, for holding this hand, and when I lifted, your hand went up because there was some mismatch between the actual, the proprioception, and the prediction. Now, when you do it yourself, you're actually aware. You already correct your forward model, and there is no mismatch. So it means that we are not, if we were only relying on feedback, right? I mean, as soon as, or the feedback would be sufficient, there shouldn't be any difference between these two processes, right? Because the feedback is the same under these two conditions. When I lift the handbag, when you yourself lift the handbag, proprioception is the same. But the motor action was very different. You were able to compensate fast when you do this action yourself, when you lift and you cannot compensate as fast when I lift the hand, which means that the system is not only relying on proprioception or external feedback at the level of the plant, but it generates a prediction. And it can only update a prediction when you voluntarily change the strategy, or not the strategy, change the load. Is this clear, this type of the two differences between, and how it shows that we are not relying only on external feedback, but also on we generate a prediction. We have some internal model of the events. Okay, so let's go for a break, and we will reconvene at 10, I guess, right?
כאילו שגם בקבוצת חברים, יכולה לעשות אולי מוטיבציה פרודקטיבית, ואז למזער את הדבר, אבל עדיין
דווקא זה מה שאני אהב. אותי מגלים אני לא כזה...
הוא לא באמת היה או כאילו...
זה לא... מה? אני לא יודע אם הייתי את כולם, אבל כאילו... אני לא יודע מה קורה באיכות מסוים של הסיפור? לא יודע. לא, בסדר. אני יכול להבין. אי אפשר שאף אחד אין לו תאריך או לשלוט. מה, מבין?
מה זה? לא.
מעניין. I include it because it's some kind of genetic preventive control or like signal towards optimal control theory. And these problems can be also formulated in reinforcement learning framework. But it's not that simple. I mean, it depends on what assumption you want. I mean, if you want it to actually, I mean, the relying on this model is somewhat complicated. I don't know.
Yeah, because last time my statement about even the figures about value distribution to embed this value distribution network in the so I found that some kinds of thing. I mean, then it was try to use this system bring it to the performance framework.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm not familiar with everything in this, but I do remember one work trying to different stuff that deals with motor control, and I don't know what is popular. I'm sure they also use like neural networks or something. I don't know. But I remember one article paper trying to generate like some kind of a general motor network controller that can be trained and with the same architecture of the network to control many kinds of motor like swimming. It was simulation, it was simulation in physics simulation. But swimming and walking and stuff, and this was in I don't think, I mean, all of this, in these kind of work, they don't have an actual model or a explicit model. They're trying to train the network based on across entropy, with the prediction. So in a way it's similar, but it's interesting.
Yeah. So my main question is like this. So you basic. So for those people, for the people you can describe, they use one module or two modules. So in this model they have like a follow and
Yeah, but if you, I mean, this is an abstraction. This is an abstraction. How can you say? If you have a network which is recurrent, and so who knows? I mean, how can you tell if there are effectively two models that? But
it sounded very abstract.
it's very abstract.
Not
The only thing I can,
practical.
but the only thing I can think about is something like an autoencoder. So maybe something like an autoencoder can, in principle, be similar to this because you try to predict something. You try to predict something, and then based on your prediction, you try to read. I don't know. I mean, this presentation, this framework of putting the boxes, the arrows, it's nice. It gives you like good intuition, but it's very abstract. I don't know. Yeah, you're a connection. You have no clue.
The thing is that the predicting part has no information that the controller doesn't have, then like there is no reason to assume that they're separate. There is no reason to assume that the controller itself can do predictions to evaluate that action.
So you argue that we can't know that it's just two modules or one module.
Things like you get the input. You have like complicated network that like the output is the action and the input to it is both the sensory systems and like the planning and other stuff. It does all sorts of prediction within itself. And eventually it like gives an output, and more than that, like the output that it gives is probably not like probably the output that it generates is not like okay now do this action, but like it gives some output and then it continues like processing, and then it also says like tell before to give this output, but now I continue processing and I know that it was the wrong thing, so it's like it keeps fixing and like giving me output. It's like everything is consistent. And somehow it's like it just learns to do the right thing.
Well, I think this is a cognition problem.
Yeah, it's like
One module or two modules.
yeah, it's like I don't know. Maybe there is some evidence that like different brain areas are responsible for different parts of processing. I hope to talk about it later. סתם שהגודל כאילו הוא לא יותר גדול, הגודל שלנו, זה לא כזה לא מעניין.
לא, אבל זה יותר כל
כן. עכשיו, הדבר הזה כאילו, הייתי יכול להיות המזלות עם חלון כזה, אבל הדבר הזה יכול להיות בסדרים שונים, ברוחב שונה. אני יכול לקחת את המזלות הרבה חלונות בגדולים שונים כאלה. אבל אם יש, כאילו...
יש לך בכלל דרך, כאילו... תתייחס על פני כל הסיגנל, או שאתה יודע כאילו מקומות חשובים
כל הסיגנל יש הרבה כאלה. כאילו יש לי איזה סיגנל מהיר, ובאותו רגע יש לי חלונות כאלה כאילו...
אבל יש לך להבדל להגיד בין מתי כבר היה ספייק ואז להגיד האם זה זמן ספייק נשמע כאילו לא. זה לא יהיה גם פשוט
תגיד את זה, כי כאילו
איך אתה מבדיל בין הדבר אחד שניתן לה?
לא כל הרעש שאני אחכה לשלו יותר, וזה אני יכול חלק מזה ובסתם לא. אבל נניח לשם טוב שהייתי צריך להגיד בין כאילו ספייק, כאילו גלגל כזה לאחד שהוא ככה. אז כן יש הבדל קטן בקטנים, אבל כדי כל הרעש כזה,
לא,
זה לא משהו ש...
לא, בסדר, אני מבין, אבל השאלה אם אתה יכול להגיד בסיגנל נקודה הזאת, נקודה הזאת, נקודה הזאת, נקודה הזאת, ספייק, אני לא יודע אם זה לא חשוב.
כאילו בעין אפשר לראות את זה. זה חלק. כאילו, אני לא יודע שזה זה אדיר, ויש את הפרטים מהאוניברסיטת ואלה שכאילו בעצמם שאין ספייקים, כאילו סתם יודעים שיש מצב. זה נושא. תמיד צוחקים, גם נעים. תמיד צוחקים, לא משנה כמה חולים תמיד אפשר להתגמש.
Alright. Okay. So, we think about the motor system. Ah, I need this. Or my. After that, there is some kind of comparator, right? You go to the books and you compare, you do this inverse model of what I said and what. Anyway. Alright. So we think that the system operates as a sort of a sophisticated feedback system that generates its own prediction, and that is sort of the basic. And whenever we'll talk later about the infrastructure, the neural infrastructure, because I'm not a computational motor control person. I'm doing physiology, but I think that this semi-computational, right, a framework actually helps us to understand or to look for different sites in the motor system and try to look how predictions are being made, how feedback changes the motor plan and the motor command that we produce. I think this is sort of helps us to or guides our research. The other thing that is related to the concept of internal models is what happens during motor learning and adaptation. Now we know that the motor system can learn new skills by interacting with the environment, right? I mean, we have information and we can learn new skills using feedback, using proprioception, using visual feedback. Now, the system, as I said before, adapts to changes in body size and limb proportions. And generally, we actually familiar with two types of learning schemes. We have a procedural and implicit learning that occurs subconsciously and is maintained for longer periods without practicing. For example, riding the bike, right? I mean, you learn it when you are young. Many of us do not practice it in a continuous manner throughout life. Nevertheless, even if I take someone who hasn't been riding his bike for a long time, he will be able to ride it again. And we don't have any explicit. We don't learn how to ride bike explicitly, right? It's not like you go home, you read the manual. I mean, you get your bike for the first time in your life, you read the manual, and you know how to ride the bike, right? There is some adaptation process, actually. And there was actually a very interesting YouTube clip about a guy that actually invented a bike that the wheel turn right when you go and you turn the handlebar. When you turn it left, the wheel goes right. And this is first of all, of course, it's complete chaos, right? You cannot perform this type of bike riding. However, after a while, after like, I think it depends on the age. So he took him like several months, but I think his son, that was 6 years old, managed to learn to overcome this change in like few weeks, several weeks. But anyway, after a while, he managed to actually operate it very well. So he was able to, but then he couldn't go back to the normal bike. So it took him several months, I don't know. So in a sense, I mean, in both cases, we can learn very non-trivial mapping between our movement and the consequences, right? We can learn it. And in a manner that is implicit. You try and try and try and try, and you get some feedback, and of course you fall, right? This is the serious feedback, and you learn. But it lasts for a long time. And after you learn this, it's not like you have two separate plans that you can use. I mean, the new map take over the old map, and you are now like have a new internal model of you and your bike, of how your movement will affect your progression or your control of the bike. And it stays for long, but it's difficult to, then you need to change it. It takes, again, another relearning. So this is what we call the procedural, the implicit learning. On the other hand, there is a declarative or explicit learning, and that is sort of acquiring knowledge. If I tell you, okay, the cafeteria is, you have to go to out of this building, turn right, and go all the way straight, and maybe you'll find something, and maybe you won't, but kind of, I don't know exactly where is the cafeteria here, but you actually learn a map. It is still a motor, I mean, it has motor motor component to it, right? Because you move, but it's not like if I let you to do this random walk in the campus, and after a while, after several years of not eating, you'll find the cafeteria or the good cafeteria, right? I mean, so there is some differences between the declarative and the procedural learning. Now we can understand that these two systems actually need to change our internal model, right? So motor learning requires an adjustment of the internal models for new kinematic or dynamic conditions. Now, of course, the walking to the cafeteria is one example, but you can think of like playing the piano, right? Playing the piano, there is some procedural component to it. I mean, you have to learn. There is no it's not try and error type of things, right? Someone tells me, okay, these and these keys will bring this note, and the sequence of notes, you have to make this movement. Now, of course, to become better, then there is some implicit component to this, and also some external feedback of your environment that tells you, okay, look, you suck. I mean, this is don't do this anymore. But at the beginning, or the major part of it is procedural, is sort of declarative. It has explicit component. Yes.
When you say directions, why is the motor connected to? I have directions. I go left. I go right.
It's true, but you go. I mean, there is a motor map. You can look, like, how do we study, like, for example, motor, like move in a maze? I mean, you are in a maze, okay? You can try and find your ways. I mean, this is and hit the walls and so on and so forth, and then you'll get a map of how you move it. This is a motor in the grand scale, right? I mean, you have to go. At the end, your execution of this knowledge is motor. Even if you know, I mean, even just knowing where the cafeteria is insufficient, right? You have to go there. You have to have a motor plan of how to make the movement, basically to go to this. But it's kind of, I agree that this is on a different scale. But playing the piano is also something that is, you have to make these movements to get that note, whatever. Okay, so, but it's a knowledge base. It's not just try and error. Okay? So, in a sense, in the learning, so why do I talk about this? Because motor learning in itself changes our internal models, okay? Because we need to adjust to novel kinematic and dynamic conditions. And now, kind of a kinematic transformation relates between events in different coordinate systems, like learning mouse movement for on-screen cursor movements. And dynamic transformation relates between forces that act on different joints. So the forces we apply. So we can actually learn the kinematics math and the we can learn kinematic transformations and dynamic transformation. For example, if you have a joystick, it can have different level of stiffness, right? So you need to make different or you need to apply different forces in order to get the same on-screen movement, right? So this is a dynamic transformation where you actually learn the forces that act on the different joints. But if for example, what I'll do, if one day you'll take the mouse and you'll switch left and right? Moving this way will actually shift the cursor to the right. Moving the mouse left will shift the cursor to the right. I mean, this is a shocking experience, right? I mean, it takes you, but you can learn this, right? And this is a kinematic transformation. Okay, so we kind of think of these two are separate representation. What are the coordinate frames we operated, and what are the forces that we have to apply? Now, we think that these two transformations, the kinematic transformation, the dynamic transformation, actually rely on different sensory modalities. So dynamic, the forces that we apply, we are usually scale it using proprioception. And the kinematic transformation, it requires visual. Because basically, if the mouse moves left or right, we need a visual feedback to tell us that the coordinate frames we operate is inverse. Okay? So we have internal models. And these internal models are adjustable by the process of learning, right? And the learning, in fact, we can learn new coordinate systems using kinematic transformations that rely on visual perception, or we can learn different forces, right? And that is like using proprioception. So, for example, if you have gears in your bike, and all of a sudden what I do is I just change the cogs, right? I mean, the wheels that actually. So what is a gear, right? It's the ratio between one wheel and a smaller set of wheels, right? That this chain runs on. I think it's called cogs. If I change the ratio without telling you, all of a sudden, you think that you are in gear 1. It should be light, but it's much harder, right? But you adjust it very fast, right? I mean, you know how to operate the bike, even if you change the system of these cog system or the forces you need to make in order to make a given movement. But there is no visual feedback that tells you, okay, look, this is wrong. I mean, you get this proprioceptive feedback that said, hey, in this gear I used to go very fast, now I need more force to apply. So internal models can be adjusted using visual feedback or proprioceptive feedback. And we can learn new maps of coordinate frames, kinematics, or dynamic component using feedback. But the system is very, very learnable. The motor system can learn new maps very fast and can change the internal models. These maps require changing of the internal models because the motor command that I need now to generate for getting the same forces is different. Both the inverse model and the forward model need to be adjusted, and we can do it very fast. Still, it's not clear how, but we can do it. Okay, so if I summarize motor behavior, we know that motor control requires a series of sensory motor transformation to produce motor output. The brain is using internal models in each stage of this transformation. Okay, we are using internal models of using forward kinematics and for computing forward and inverse kinematics. Motor control is not static. It's not that we reach some plateau and that's it. It's continuously being modified and recalibrated, right? That happens all the time. You get a new mouse, the sensitivity is different. It's no time. You don't even think about that, right? You're immediately able to recalibrate this your system. motor learning relies on sensory input, improves motor control in other situations. Even, trying to learn new math without a proprioception is possible, probably, right? But it will take a very long time. And the fact that we continuously sense our environment, both via proprioception and via visual feedback, makes this adaptation much faster. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
So, could you go back to the previous slide?
Yes.
So for the dynamic and the kinetic, so is there any connection with the model you described before, so about the forward and the inverse?
So how
it seems like for the dynamic is the inverse, and for the kinetic is the forward.
I think both of them needs to be adapted, because the way you generate the command in itself, if now you need to, if I give you joint angles, but the mouse will go the other way around, you also need to, the translation between the joint angles and the movement needs, you need to, if you want to make now a specific move, I guess it depends on how do you define the target, the goal of your movement. If the goal of the movement is moving the cursor, then both models needs to be updated, right? Because now if you want to move the cursor from left to right, you need a different command than before. So both the inverse model, because the inverse model requires you need a different command, right? But also the forward, because your prediction will be different, right? Because the same command, right? It's like so the same command now will move the cursor right instead of left. So I guess it depends on how you define the goal. If the goal is changing, if the goal is just moving your hand to the right, then you're right. But if the goal is defined in cursor, what you want to do is to move the cursor to the left. Now you need to switch both models, because they are linked in a way, right? These two are linked in if you change the way your angles generate the goals, also you know the goal, you need a new set of angles. So now the new set of angles need to generate a different prediction than before. But that's, I guess it depends on how you define the goal of these of the task. Okay. Okay. So one of the things now, but in terms, the question that we ask is again, what is the implementation of all these computational processes in the motor system? Now, we think that understanding the properties of motor control, of motor actions, can actually tell us about the way the system operates. And again, if we look at what are the properties of the system, it seems that there are several properties that in fact suggest very simple behavior. And this is that motor behavior under different conditions tend to be very stereotypical. It tends to be adaptive, and there is some velocity precision trade-off. So as we move faster, we are less precise, and we have rapid learning process. Now, what do I mean by this? So what is the stereotypic behavior? If we take a person and ask him to make movements from a center target or from each of these targets to any other target, and we plot these targets, we can see that we can make rapid movements that can be either have long amplitude or short amplitude. However, what people have found is that independent of the amplitude of the movement, so T1 to T4 is actually relatively short movement, but T2 to T5 is actually very long movement, independent. The movements that are being produced are very simple. They have bell-shaped velocity profile, okay? So they rise, it's a monophasic, unimodal velocity profile with a bell shape. Okay? We don't have like a multiple velocity or multiple peaks in the velocity profile. And what is more interesting is irrespective of the amplitude, the time it takes to make these different movements is roughly the same. So in a sense, we scale the velocity of the movement so that movement will always take roughly the same time. There is some isochronous property for the movement, of ballistic movement. So these are all what we call ballistic movement. And despite the fact that we need, you see here that the angles, shoulder angles, are very different. We need very different joint angles in order to make this movement compared to this movement, right? This movement has strong elbow component and maybe not a lot of shoulder. This movement has both shoulder and elbow. So we have the movement, the produced movement requires multi-joint coordination, operation of both shoulder and elbow at different extent. They require different angles and different velocities of shoulder angles, but despite the complex infrastructure in terms of the joint of the musculoskeletal system, the produced movement is very simple. We don't see here that this movement requires coordination across joints. We see a very simple velocity profile. And in some ways, in some implicit way, we scale the velocity so the movement will take roughly the same time. So movements, although they are being generated by complex systems, are in fact stereotypical and in a way simple, more simpler than the underlying. If you could try to compute the interaction between the joint and the shoulder, you'll find that there is a lot of the equations, the dynamic equation that actually describe this movement is rather complex. However, the observed movement is simple. The other thing, and I think Matti already showed this to you, you see that no matter which plant that you are using, handwriting is roughly similar. So using right arm with wrist immobilized, left hand, using your, gripping the pen with your teeth, okay? This is C, right? It's very similar to your left hand, and this is D, E, sorry, is with the pen attached to the foot, okay? So you can make, that's pretty tough, right? I don't know if there is any training here, but but the properties of the writing of the word, of the letters, the single letters, is actually very similar. And it's not that you need to relearn everything from scratch, which means that some movements are simple, but they also have at some level, they are fairly abstract. So before you send the command downstream to the working to the effector, the handwriting or the motor command is generated in a manner that is independent of the effector, or they are being coded in an abstract manner. Okay. Also, if I'll ask you to make these reaching movements in a room that rotates, okay, so there is some Coriolis forces on the arm, still very fast you will adapt and you will generate the same pointing movement. So this is, again, during normal conditions. This is the thin black line. Somewhere here you can see. There is, when you have half a kilo mass attached to your arm, and when there are forces, Coriolis forces on the arm are fast, this is in red, plus the weight. Okay, so you are going in a moving room. It doesn't matter how fast the room is moving. It doesn't matter if you have a weight attached to your hand. You're making the same movement. So somehow the system is actually designed or optimized some final endpoint position. It doesn't matter the exact forces that operate on your limb. You generate very similar trajectories under these different conditions. So the system is rapidly adapted, and also, so we can say that specific motor actions can be performed in many ways, but the outcome is more or less similar, handwriting, but also the ballistic movement. It has the same, it takes, not exactly, but roughly the same time with independent of the amplitude. We think that actually tells us that in the brain motor commands are abstract irrespective of the joint angles. So at least at some level, motor commands are coded in an abstract manner, in a manner that is not dependent on the exact effector that you are using. So the interesting part is this simple motor behavior. It seems to be in contrast with the complex infrastructure, the joints and the independent joints and the interaction among them are much more complicated than the seemingly simple motor behavior. So this actually leads us to the question of what is the neural basis for the observed motor behavior. And that is what we're going to talk about from now on. I mean, we know, or at least we have some idea of what is the motor properties or the properties of the motor behavior. Now the question is, at which level this abstract motor command is being coded for, and where, at which level this motor command is being translated to specific or joint-specific actions. Okay? So we have these two representations exist at different hierarchies probably in the motor system, and the question is how these abstract goal, how and where this abstract goal is being translated into very specific muscle-based motor command. Because eventually, all here, you have like set of muscles, and the system needs to give the exact spatiotemporal command to each of these muscles. And how this is done, this is really the question that we are trying to understand. So what is the neural infrastructure? So we know that there are many motor areas that are contributing to motor actions. We have the motor areas in the cortex. We have a basal ganglia that, although people try to say, a kind of basal ganglia is currently implicated in high cognitive, reward-based functions, and I think you will learn about this very soon. However, you have to remember that, in fact, the basal ganglia, all its output, or most large part of the output, is being sent back to the motor thalamus, and from there to the motor cortex, motor and prefrontal cortex. But it is part, the basal ganglia is, in fact, all its function is being relayed through these areas, and it is and all the deficit that we see in dysfunction, basal ganglia dysfunctions, are eventually they're motor dysfunction. Parkinson's disease, for example, but also obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is repeating the same motor action again and again. And this motor action can be, checking again or washing your hands like 1,000 times, or saying, repeating something again and again, but repeating a motor action. So
it's more like repeating an idea, because it's maybe.
I don't know. I think it's most.
Repeating words in your head.
It's not necessarily in your head. You can actually say this.
There are some.
It's true. I mean, in some cases, you can shut the translation from these words that you say, like internally to the external representation. You shut it from the muscles. But it's not clear to me, like motor imagery. Is this a motor or a non-motor fact, right? I mean, is this something motor or non-motor? Where does it stop? And in OCD, there is a very strong motor component, because doing, in a sense, I mean, in its traditional form, doing the same thing again and again, that's what brings to the kind of relief of this, that is the drive. Now, of course, in modern life, I mean, we can shut it. We have the ideas that are repetitive, or words that we want to say, but we manage to block it from being expressed at the muscle levels. But I'm not so sure it's not motor.
No, there are people do have some rituals of counting or things that are not necessarily motor.
I don't know, but the question is whether you count really. I mean, you do this. Is this the actual count, the abstract idea, or the you need to repeat the action itself?
Counting 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, but
not counting stuff or.
No, counting.
Things.
But if you say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, there is a motor component to this, right? To the actual say of that, and
you can find a motor component in everything.
it's true, and I think everything is motor. That's my belief. I mean, there is no behavior that is non-motor. I mean, that's sort of that's how I started this talk. Everything is motor. There is no, like, what is non-motor? I mean,
these rituals, you're right.
the rituals are very motor. And okay, for another example, depression. People think about depression as related to basal ganglia dysfunction. This is another, or Tourette. I mean, that's kind of another thing that you have to say. I mean, you say words that, I mean, it's not it's not independent of the motor aspect of pronunciation. That's what I'm trying. All these rituals. I mean, they are words, but they are being pronounced. Pronunciation is a motor action. In depression, is this a fact that a person comes to a psychiatrist and says, look, I cannot get up out of bed in the morning? Is this because you don't want to get out of bed, or your motor threshold is just so high that you cannot physically perform this action? I mean, there is motor component to all of these. We tend to think about psychiatric disorders at something high cognitive level, but I would claim, and I don't think I'm the only person, but I would definitely claim that there is a motor component to a lot of these, what is called to be cognitive or psychiatric disorders. And the motor component is, in fact, a very important part. Of course, the problem is in the nervous system, right? In the kind of neurons that are not necessarily motor neurons, but still, the output, the manifestation is motor. But we can argue on this later. Anyway, so we think that what are the part of the motor of the motor system, the motor cortical areas, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum for sure, right? Basal ganglia, we tend to think about it as an action selection or reward-based action selection, but you have to select an action out of many options. And that is the motor part of it. The cerebellum is considered to be controlling timing and coordination. Motor learning the cerebellum was implicated with motor learning, generating the internal models that we talked about. There are a set of brainstem motor nuclei, so a set of low-level nuclei that are actually extremely important for motor control. These are also part of the motor system, and of course, the spinal cord the gray matter that contains spinal internudes and motor neurons. So proper action or proper movement requires coordination across almost the entire brain, from the cortex all the way down to the spinal cord. All these areas need to be act in coordination, and most of the studies or at least in non-human primates and humans, the motor cortex is considered to be specifically important for performing voluntary movements and orchestrating motor behavior. So recently, I reviewed a paper where they took a mice and they removed the entire set of the corticospinal system. So the motor cortex was disconnected from any downstream motor areas, the spinal cord in that case. There was no impact on the mouse behavior. Of course, the really funny part is then they removed the entire cortex of the mouse. So they completely, but there was no observable impact on the mouse behavior. So mice are not really relying on cortex in general, and specifically on motor cortex for daily action. They require the motor cortex for learning new skills, but it is not necessary for them for motor performance. This is not the case for humans, as we know from stroke patients, right? It is not the case for humans and non-human primates. So many of the studies of the control of motor activity was done in non-human primates, and the reason is because this is the appropriate model for understanding motor behavior. Yes?
You say it's not the case in humans from stroke patients, but in the mouse case, did they remove its cortex like after it was a grown-up mouse and it learned or
Yeah. It learned a skill. It learned a skill. They removed let's talk about just the corticospinal.
Yeah.
They removed the corticospinal. This removal did not affect learned skills that were already acquired, but the mouse could not acquire new skills. But of course, new skills, like these paradigms are usually kind of very unnatural for the mouse. So they reach and grasp is not something mice do normally. So these type of skills were kind of difficult or impossible for the mouse to learn after removal of the corticospinal. Yes?
They remove it by vision, maybe?
No, they remove it by specific, they managed to mark specifically cells, the corticospinal cells. They use a marker, a genetic marker, and then it's kind of a diphtheria toxin. You can actually, after a while, you let the mouse eat something, and it lesions those specifically modified subset of neurons. So they just remove the corticospinal system.
Maybe we're pursuing some kind of compensation?
But even if you take a mice and you just lesion it, like, do aspiration of the motor cortex, there is no effect on motor cortex. Because they really don't need, most of the computation in mice are done at the level of, the highest computations are at the midbrain level.
I'm just wondering, what's the time difference between the vision and the testing of the actual behavior?
Oh.
Because maybe, if you wait too long, then you see some kind of...
No, I don't think. I think they kind of. Okay, well, this was a while ago, but I'm sure they kind of. The cells were. There was no compensation already. Some kind of the mouse recovered, but there was no long-term. There was no time for compensation. Obviously, they couldn't learn even after this manipulation. They couldn't learn, so there was dissociation. And in monkeys, for example, if you have even a small lesion and at the arm-related area of the brain, of the motor cortex, some of it will not recover this. Okay, there won't be any recovery. There will be compensation from the other hand, but there won't be recovery of the function of that specific hand. Okay, so I just all right. Okay, so we kind of got to the point of descending pathways. So on Thursday, I'm going to talk about talk a little bit about the connection, the way supraspinal sites actually recruit motor neurons that are located at the spinal cord in order to produce motor action, and then we'll talk about the motor cortex. Now, there is someone who is presenting a paper. You are you too. So together. Okay. Okay. So can you? So you are all free to go, and I just want to.